It was a clear, crisp morning in late autumn when Maria, a retired schoolteacher from a small town, set off on her journey to visit her only son, David. She clutched her old, worn-out suitcase filled with homemade treats and simple, sentimental gifts she'd carefully wrapped for him. The chill in the air was nothing compared to the warmth that radiated from her heart as she thought of seeing him again. It had been years since they'd been together. Life had pulled him away to the city, where he had pursued his career with all the drive she'd encouraged in him. But now, despite his busy life and his sparse calls home, she couldn't shake the urge to see him. Maria wanted to reconnect, to remind him of where he came from, and to see if he still held close the values she'd spent a lifetime teaching him. The bus ride was long, winding through miles of countryside before finally giving way to the crowded streets of the bustling city. Maria sat quietly by the window, watching the world whiz past, her mind drifting between memories of David as a child and the faint worry that maybe he had changed too much. The city was a far cry from the quiet streets of her small town, and Maria was both exhilarated and slightly intimidated by its vastness. She tightened her grip on her purse, feeling the comforting weight of an old photograph of David as a boy tucked inside, taken long before success and wealth had come into his life. As the bus pulled into the station, Maria's heart beat a little faster. She gathered her things, exited the bus, and squinted in awe at the towering buildings around her. Her eyes scanned the unfamiliar streets, bustling with people dressed in suits, seemingly all in a hurry, barely noticing the frail, elderly woman who had just arrived. She asked a passerby for directions and followed the bustling sidewalks toward David's address, every step carrying a mix of excitement and trepidation. After a long walk, she found herself at the foot of an imposing, high-walled mansion, nothing like the modest homes she was used to seeing back in her town. It was grand, palatial, surrounded by tall iron gates and lush, manicured gardens, but it looked cold, almost unwelcoming. Maria approached the gates, looking around for a doorbell. She rang it, waiting with growing anticipation, but there was only silence. She rang again, shifting on her feet, wondering if David even knew she was coming. She hadn't warned him. It was a surprise, a way to rekindle the closeness they once had. But now, standing alone in front of this mansion, she wondered if that had been the right decision. Suddenly, a security guard appeared, peering at her with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but firm, as if this wasn't the kind of place where elderly women wandered in unannounced. "Yes," Maria replied, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm here to see my son, David. I'm his mother." The guard looked at her doubtfully, glancing over his shoulder at the grand house, and then back at her. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded slowly and opened the gate. "Wait here," he said before disappearing into the house. Maria took a deep breath, watching the mansion's front door, hoping David would come rushing out, delighted by her surprise visit. But instead of her son, a housekeeper appeared, her expression one of mild discomfort as she ushered Maria into the foyer. The interior was breathtaking, decorated with expensive artwork and lavish furniture, but it felt strangely impersonal, almost as if no one truly lived there. She waited, clutching her suitcase tightly, feeling out of place and growing more uneasy by the second. It wasn't long before David entered the room, but rather than the warm, welcoming smile she expected, he looked taken aback, almost startled to see her standing there. Maria smiled, reaching out to hug him, but David only gave her a stiff, awkward embrace. "Mother," he said, his tone strained, You should have called. I wasn't expecting you." Maria felt her heart sink slightly. This wasn't the response she had imagined. She'd hoped for joy, for the reunion she'd been dreaming of, but instead, she saw tension in his eyes, something distant and unfamiliar. "I thought it would be a nice surprise," she said softly, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "It's been so long, David. I wanted to see you." He nodded, avoiding her gaze. Yes, of course. It's just that. "Things are busy here. I have meetings and, well, it's not the best time." He looked around the room, as if searching for an escape, and Maria couldn't shake the feeling that he was embarrassed by her presence. The housekeeper hovered nearby, glancing at them with what Maria sensed was pity. She felt like an intruder in her own son's life, surrounded by wealth and luxury that felt so foreign to her. The walls of the house were adorned with abstract art pieces she didn't recognize, and the entire place felt more like a museum than a home. As she sat on an oversized leather chair, she noticed there were no family photos, no reminders of the simpler life they once shared, no signs that her son's roots were even remembered here. An awkward silence stretched between them before David cleared his throat. "I'll have Lydia, my housekeeper, show you to the guest room. I have some work to finish, but we'll talk later." Before she could reply, he left the room, leaving Maria sitting there, feeling small and out of place. Lydia approached her gently, gesturing for her to follow. As they walked through the halls, Maria caught glimpses of expensive furniture, luxurious decor, and perfectly polished surfaces, but there was an emptiness in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into every corner of the mansion. The guest room was grand, more luxurious than anything Maria had ever seen, but it felt lonely. She set her suitcase on the bed, her heart heavy with disappointment. This wasn't the reunion she had imagined, and the son she saw today felt like a stranger. She sat quietly, gazing out the window at the vast gardens below, wondering where things had gone wrong when they had drifted so far apart. As the day wore on, Maria couldn't shake the sense of unease. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way David had looked at her, the way he had rushed away, the guarded expressions on the faces of the staff. She felt like an outsider in a life that should have been familiar, and it left her feeling hollow. She tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. The nagging sense that there was more to this house, more to her son's life, gnawed at her. And as night fell, Maria resolved to find out exactly what that was. This was no longer just a visit. It felt like a journey to uncover the truth, a truth that her son was hiding, and she couldn't rest until she knew what that was. She had come all this way to reconnect, but now she sensed that the journey had only just begun, and the revelations that awaited her were more than she ever could have anticipated. That night, Maria lay in the luxurious guest room, staring at the intricate patterns on the ceiling, her mind too restless to settle. She had hoped that sleep would ease the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since arriving, but each hour only deepened her sense of discomfort. The day's events replayed in her mind, the cold formality of David's greeting, the housekeeper's strained politeness, and David's quick departure. This wasn't the son she remembered. The boy who used to burst through the front door with a grin, eager to tell her every detail of his day. It was as though his success had erected walls around him, walls that even she, his own mother, couldn't breach. The clock on the ornate dresser ticked on, marking each hour that she lay awake, growing more determined to uncover what had changed. She rose from the bed, moving quietly, and stepped out into the hallway. The mansion was quiet, bathed in dim light from wall sconces that illuminated the dark wood paneling and marble floors. She had noticed the housekeeper eyeing her suspiciously earlier, as if Maria's very presence were a disruption to the carefully constructed order of the household. But now, with no one around, she felt emboldened to explore, hoping to find a piece of her son in this massive, impersonal home. Maria walked slowly down the hall, passing room after room, each one closed off like a hidden chapter of David's life. At the end of the corridor, a large double door stood slightly ajar. She moved toward it, feeling a tug of curiosity she couldn't ignore. Pushing the door open, she found herself in what looked like an office. The room was dim, but the moonlight filtering in through the tall windows cast a faint glow over a polished mahogany desk, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and a scattering of papers across the desk. Stepping closer, Maria saw documents she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before reaching for a paper on top of the pile. It was a letter addressed to David, the letterhead bearing the name of a prominent law firm she recognized from news articles. Her brow furrowed as she read the words, piecing together snippets that hinted at a lawsuit, legal fees, and something ominous about David's finances. Maria's heart pounded as she absorbed this revelation. David was wealthy. At least, that's what she had always believed. The grandeur of this mansion, his designer clothes, the aloof staff, all of it painted a picture of affluence. But these documents told a different story. Her mind raced, remembering how David had avoided her questions about his life. He'd always been proud, never one to admit defeat or ask for help, but now it seemed as though he had been living in a house of cards, one that could collapse at any moment. She carefully placed the letter back on the desk, her mind swimming with questions. As she turned to leave the room, she caught sight of a photograph on a nearby shelf. It was a family portrait, taken years ago, showing David as a young boy, standing proudly beside her and her late husband. Her heart ached as she studied it, remembering the days when their family was close-knit, grounded, and happy. She wondered how they had drifted so far from those simple, joyful days. The sound of footsteps startled her, and Maria quickly slipped out of the office, her heart pounding. She ducked down a side hallway, listening as the footsteps grew louder, then faded away in the opposite direction. Maria returned to her room, shaken by what she had discovered, but now more determined than ever to find out the truth. She sensed there was more beneath the surface, something that went beyond money troubles. This was no longer just a mother's visit. It was a quest to understand the life her son had built and the secrets he was keeping from her. The following morning, Maria joined David for breakfast, her resolve steeled. He looked tired, as if he had spent the night wrestling with his own troubles, but he forced a smile as he greeted her. Maria studied his face, noticing the lines of worry etched around his eyes. She wanted to ask him directly, to confront him about what she'd found, but she knew that David's pride would resist any intrusion. Instead, she chose a gentler approach. "David," she said, her voice soft, "you've worked so hard to build the life here. I'm proud of you. You know that, don't you?" He glanced at her, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Thank you, Mother," he replied, but his tone lacked the warmth she remembered. "I know things must get overwhelming," she continued, hoping he might open up. "With such a big house, so much responsibility, it can't be easy." David's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "It's part of life," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I've made choices, and I have to live with them." The guardedness in his voice made her heart ache, but she didn't press further. Instead, she spent the day quietly observing, noticing things she hadn't before, the way the staff avoided eye contact, the strained expressions on their faces, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to give. The sense of tension in the house was palpable, a subtle yet constant undercurrent that made Maria feel as though she were walking on thin ice. That evening, as she was preparing to retire to her room, she noticed one of the younger staff members, a housemaid, slipping into a small side room near the kitchen. Something in the maid's hurried, anxious movements caught Maria's attention, and without thinking, she followed. She entered the room quietly, watching as the maid rummaged through a pile of letters stacked on a small desk. The maid froze when she noticed Maria, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I'm sorry, Mom," she stammered, her face flushed. "I was just looking for something." Maria's kind eyes softened. "It's all right, dear," she said gently. "You seem worried. Is everything okay?" The maid hesitated, biting her lip as she looked down, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, she sighed, glancing around to ensure they were alone before speaking in a low, hesitant voice. "There are things happening here. Things Mr. David doesn't want anyone to know." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The maid shifted uncomfortably. "He's in trouble, ma'am. Financial trouble. He's borrowed money from people. Not good people. They'd been calling, sending letters. Some of us, We're afraid for him, but he won't listen. He's too proud, and he doesn't want you to know." Maria's heart sank as the weight of the maid's words settled on her. Her son, her only child, was in deep trouble, and he had kept it all hidden, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of shame. But the thought of him struggling alone, burdened by the consequences of his choices, tore at her. She thanked the maid, reassuring her that she wouldn't speak of their conversation, and returned to her room, her mind reeling. That night, Maria lay awake, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. She felt anger at David for hiding the truth, sorrow for the hardships he faced, and a fierce resolve to help him, no matter how stubborn he might be. She knew that he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, and unless someone intervened, he could lose everything: his home, his reputation, even his safety. As dawn approached, Maria made a decision. She would confront David, not as a mother trying to pry into his affairs, but as someone who loved him unconditionally, someone who would stand by him no matter the cost. She understood now that her visit was no longer just about rekindling their relationship. It was about rescuing her son from the darkness he allowed to consume him. She would uncover the truth, piece by piece, no matter how painful, and she would do whatever it took to bring David back to himself. This was no longer just a visit. It was a mission to save her family. And as she sat there in the early morning light, watching the first rays of dawn break over the city skyline, Maria felt a quiet strength rising within her. She was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to face the secrets, the shame, and the sacrifices required. She would not leave her son to face this alone. The morning sun cast a pale light across the mansion's polished floors as Maria sat waiting for David in the grand living room. She had steeled herself for this conversation, knowing it would be one of the most difficult she'd ever had with him. She looked around at the opulence, the crystal vases filled with flowers that seemed more decorative than comforting, the immaculate furniture that seemed untouched by the warmth of family life. This was not the home she'd imagined her son would build, and now she was beginning to understand why. David entered the room slowly, his expression guarded, clearly sensing that something was on her mind. He was dressed sharply, as always, but Maria noticed the subtle signs of strain, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders. She gestured for him to sit across from her, and he obeyed, though with a hint of reluctance. "David," she began, her voice steady but filled with concern, "I need to talk to you about what's really going on here." He flinched slightly, his eyes darting away from hers, and she saw the walls go up almost instantly. "Mother, I don't know what you mean. Everything is fine." She shook her head, unwilling to let him deflect this time. "I know it isn't. I've seen things, heard things." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You're in trouble, David, and I'm not here to judge you, but I am here to help you." David's face hardened, and for a moment she thought he might walk out, refuse to engage. But then something in him seemed to break, and he slumped forward, covering his face with his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "I've made a mess of everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I could handle it all. The business, the pressure, the expectations. But somewhere along the way, it all got out of control." Maria leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on his knee. "Tell me everything, David. I want to understand." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to put his thoughts into words. "It started a few years ago," he said slowly. "The company was doing well, but I wanted more. I wanted to expand, to make a name for myself in this city. Everyone else seemed to be succeeding, making connections, growing their wealth, and I felt like I was being left behind." He hesitated, as if the words were too painful to say. "So I took risks. I borrowed money, made deals I thought would pay off. And at first they did. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then, one of the investments failed. And then another. I kept borrowing, kept trying to cover my tracks, thinking I could fix it. But it only made things worse. Maria's heart broke as she listened, realizing the depth of his desperation. She could see how his ambition had driven him to this point, how his desire to prove himself had led him down a dark path. But there was more. She could feel it in the tension that hung between them. "There's something else, isn't there?" she asked gently. David nodded, his face filled with shame. "Yes. I got involved with people I shouldn't have. People who offered me a way out, a chance to get back on my feet. But their help came at a cost." Maria's stomach twisted as she imagined the kinds of people he might be talking about, the dangers he'd put himself in. "David, these people, are they threatening you?" He nodded, his expression grim. "They've been calling, showing up here. They want their money back, and they don't care how they get it. I've been trying to keep them at bay, but they're losing patience." Maria felt a surge of fear, both for her son and for the life he'd entangled himself in. She looked around at the lavish surroundings, the trappings of wealth that had cost him so dearly. "Why didn't you tell me, David? Why didn't you ask for help?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I couldn't, Mother. I couldn't let you see me like this, as a failure. I thought I could handle it alone, that I didn't need anyone. But now," his voice trailed off, filled with regret. "Now, I don't know if I'll ever get out of this." Maria felt a mixture of anger and sadness, wishing she could go back in time, stop him from making these choices. But the past was beyond her reach. What mattered now was finding a way forward, a way to help him break free from the traps he'd set for himself. "David," she said firmly, "we're going to get through this. Together. You don't have to face this alone anymore." He looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes, but there was also fear, a deep-seated fear that seemed to grip him like a vice. "But these people, Mother, they don't just go away. They've made it clear that if I don't pay, they'll take what they want." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Maria's resolve only grew stronger. She would not let these people destroy her son, no matter the cost. She spent the next few hours talking with David, discussing options, ways they could gather enough money to pay off his debts, legitimate options that might give him a chance to rebuild his life honestly. It was a daunting task, but Maria was determined. After they finished, David seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the long road ahead. Maria stayed by his side, refusing to let him fall back into the isolation that had driven him to this point. She could see glimpses of the boy he once was, the son who had once dreamed of a simple, fulfilling life, unburdened by the pressures of wealth and status. But just when it seemed as though things were looking up, there was an unexpected knock at the door. David froze, his face draining of color. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as he rose, his movements stiff, his expression filled with dread. "It's them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They've come to collect." Maria watched as he walked slowly toward the door, steeling himself to face whoever was on the other side. She wanted to follow, to stand by him, but David gestured for her to stay back. She could see the fear in his eyes, the determination to protect her from the harsh reality of his situation. The door opened, and Maria caught a glimpse of a tall, intimidating man standing in the entryway, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked past David, his gaze settling on Maria with a faint sneer. David spoke quietly, trying to placate the man, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The man's expression grew harder, and Maria felt her heart race as she watched her son confront the consequences of his choices, powerless to intervene. After a tense exchange, the man finally left, but not before delivering a chilling warning. "This is your last chance, David," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You pay up, or we'll take what's ours, and we won't be gentle about it." As the door closed, Maria saw the look of despair on David's face, the realization that he was out of time, out of options. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, grounding him with her presence. "We'll find a way," she whispered, though her own heart was filled with fear. "I won't let them take you down. I promise." In that moment, she made a silent vow, a vow to protect her son no matter what it took, even if it meant putting herself in harm's way. The danger was real, and the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. But Maria knew that she had to be strong, for David, and for the hope of a future where he could finally live in peace. They spent the night talking, planning, desperate to find a solution. Maria was determined to save him, to bring him back to the life he'd once dreamed of. But as the shadows deepened around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a struggle that would test them both, a journey that would demand every ounce of strength and courage they possessed. And as dawn broke, Maria prepared herself for the battle that lay ahead, ready to face whatever challenges awaited, with the fierce resolve of a mother who would stop at nothing to save her child. As the days passed, Maria's worry for David only grew. Despite their efforts to find a way out of his debt, every option seemed to lead them deeper into a web of obstacles and dangers. The intimidating visits from David's collectors continued, each more intense than the last, leaving him in a constant state of fear. He grew paranoid, glancing over his shoulder, jumping at shadows, his once confident demeanor eroding under the weight of mounting pressure. Maria could see how the strain was affecting him, how he was losing himself in the mess he created. She watched as he stopped sleeping, barely ate, and seemed to be slipping further away from the son she once knew. Her heart ached, but she was determined not to let him fall. She spent her days quietly observing the household, hoping to understand the full extent of the problem, and perhaps find something, anything, that could help him escape. One evening, after a particularly tense encounter with one of the debt collectors, Maria knew she needed to take matters into her own hands. David had just retreated to his office, visibly shaken, and she could hear the murmur of his frustrated voice through the thick walls as he made desperate phone calls, begging for more time, trying to negotiate with people who had no interest in giving him a break. As she moved through the house, her gaze drifted to the closed door at the end of the hall, the one room she hadn't dared enter yet, the one David had warned her not to go near. There was something about that door, something that made her feel it held secrets David wasn't ready to share. But now, with his back against the wall and his life unraveling, Maria felt a growing need to understand everything that was hidden in this house. Steeling herself, she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dark, filled with an oppressive silence. She switched on the light, her breath catching at the sight of what lay before her. It was an office, but unlike the rest of the house, it was cluttered, chaotic, with papers and folders scattered across the desk and floor. This was a place of secrets, a room where David had buried parts of his life he didn't want anyone to see. Maria moved carefully, her eyes scanning the papers strewn about. Some were invoices, others were letters, documents filled with legal jargon and signatures. Her gaze fell on a stack of letters at the edge of the desk, all marked with red stamps that read Urgent or Final Notice. She picked one up, her heart sinking as she read the contents. These were threats, demands for payments, warnings that if David didn't settle his debts, he would face legal action, asset seizures, even violence. As she sifted through the papers, Maria noticed a particular document that caught her attention. It was a contract, bearing David's signature at the bottom, along with the names of several shadowy figures she'd never heard of. But the nature of the contract was clear. David had signed away more than just money. He'd promised assets, his business shares, even personal items of value. It was as if he had gambled his entire life on a single reckless bet, and now he was paying the price. But it was another set of papers that truly made her stomach turn. These were personal letters, notes that David had written but never sent. In them, he expressed feelings of isolation, desperation, and shame. He admitted to being trapped, to feeling like he was drowning, but unable to ask for help. One letter, in particular, was addressed to her. Maria's hands shook as she read the words he penned, but never had the courage to share. "Dear Mom," it began, his handwriting shaky but sincere. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to show you this. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to tell you the truth. But I need you to know that I never wanted this life. I never wanted to become the person I am now, a man hiding from his own reflection, too ashamed to face the people who love him. I wanted to make you proud, to prove that I could be someone. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. And now, I don't know how to find my way back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears blurred Maria's vision as she finished the letter, her heart breaking for the boy who had once been so full of dreams. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the depth of his pain as though it were her own. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about saving David from financial ruin. It was about saving him from himself, from the guilt and shame that had poisoned his soul. She had to remind him of who he was, of the strength and integrity he had once carried with pride. She carefully returned the letter to its place, her mind racing with a plan that was both risky and desperate. She would confront the people who were pulling the strings, the ones who had ensnared her son in this nightmare. She knew it was dangerous, that these were people who dealt in fear and intimidation, but she also knew that she couldn't sit idly by while her son's life fell apart. If David couldn't fight for himself, then she would fight for him. The following day, Maria made inquiries around the city, asking discreet questions and following leads until she managed to locate the headquarters of the organization that had loaned David the money. It was a nondescript building, hidden away in a rundown part of town. But as she approached, she felt a surge of determination. She had spent her entire life facing challenges, raising a son on her own, teaching generations of children to stand up for what was right. This was just one more battle, and she was ready to face it. Inside, she was met with cold stares and dismissive glances, but she refused to be intimidated. She demanded to speak with the person in charge, standing her ground until a tall, imposing man finally emerged, his expression one of mild curiosity and faint annoyance. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm David's mother," she replied firmly, her voice unwavering, "and I'm here to negotiate on his behalf." The man chuckled, clearly amused by her audacity. "You? An elderly woman, coming here to bargain with us? Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are," she replied, meeting his gaze with steely resolve. "And I know that you're exploiting people like my son, feeding off their desperation. But I also know that you're businessmen, and that there's always room for negotiation." The man's amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of interest. "And what exactly do you have to offer?" Maria took a deep breath, her mind racing as she formulated her response. She had nothing tangible to offer, no wealth or assets to trade, but she had something far more valuable, her resolve and her willingness to fight. "I can't give you money," she admitted, "but I can give you my word that my son will pay his debts in full if you give him the time he needs to turn things around. I'll make sure he does. But if you continue to hound him, if you push him to the brink, then I'll make it my mission to expose your practices, to bring attention to every dirty deal you've made. I may be just an old woman, but I know people, good people who won't stand for this kind of abuse." The man studied her, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the weight of her threat. Finally, he smirked, clearly impressed by her tenacity. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said slowly. "Fine. We'll give him one more chance. But if he fails to pay up, we won't be so lenient next time." Maria nodded, relief flooding her as she realized she had won a small victory. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start, a chance for David to regain his footing without the constant threat of violence looming over him. She thanked the man and left the building, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. When she returned to the mansion, she found David waiting for her, his face pale and drawn. He had clearly been worried, aware of the risk she had taken on his behalf. "Mother," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't believe you did that. You shouldn't have." But she silenced him with a gentle smile. pulling him into a tight embrace. "David, I did what any mother would do. I believe in you. I know you can find your way out of this, but you have to fight, and you have to remember who you are. This is your chance to start fresh." He looked at her, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I don't deserve you." "That's nonsense," she replied firmly. "You're my son, and no matter what mistakes you've made, I will always stand by you." As they sat together, planning his next steps, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This battle was far from over, but they were no longer alone. She had given him a chance, and now it was up to David to rebuild his life, to find his way back to the man he once was. And as the night wore on, filled with quiet conversations and promises of change, Maria knew that they would face whatever came next together, bound by a love that no debt, no threat, and no shadowy figure could ever break. In the days that followed, David threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to make the most of the chance his mother had fought so hard to secure. Maria stayed with him, supporting him in every way she could, from helping him organize his finances to offering steady encouragement during moments of doubt. She could see the strain he was under, but she also saw glimpses of the son she'd raised, the boy who had once dreamed of making a difference, of building something worthwhile. David had managed to negotiate with a few key investors, securing some temporary relief and buying himself precious time. He was even able to reconnect with old friends and mentors, reaching out for advice, and in some cases, help. Though his pride still stung from having to ask for support, he knew he had no other choice if he wanted to rebuild. Little by little, he began to see a path forward, one that involved shedding the empty, glamorous facade he'd constructed around himself and focusing on what truly mattered. One evening, as Maria sat in the living room, sorting through old family photos she'd brought from home, David joined her. He looked tired but hopeful, his eyes carrying a new sense of clarity. He sat beside her, glancing at the photographs of his younger self, smiling and carefree, standing next to his mother and his father in front of their small, modest home. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own memories. "Mom," David finally said, his voice low and sincere, "I don't know how to thank you. I was so lost, and you reminded me of who I am. I don't know if I would have made it through without you." Maria reached over, taking his hand in hers. "David, all I did was stand by you. The strength you've shown these past few days, that came from within you. You just had to remember it." He nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "I'm starting to see things differently now. I realize how much I let myself get swept away by what others expected of me, what I thought I had to become to be successful. But maybe I was just running from myself all along." They continued to talk, reflecting on how easily David had fallen into the traps of wealth and status, and how the city's pressures had eroded the values he once held dear. Maria shared stories from his childhood, moments when he had shown kindness, integrity, and a fierce sense of justice. These were qualities she knew still lived within him, buried beneath the weight of ambition and fear. As they sat together, a knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. David's face darkened, and Maria sensed the tension return. The visits from debt collectors had subsided since her confrontation with the organization, but he knew they were watching him closely, waiting for any sign of failure. With a heavy sigh, he stood and opened the door, his shoulders tensing as he saw a man he recognized as one of the collectors, a mid-level enforcer sent to keep David on his toes. The man, dressed in a dark coat with a calculating gaze, glanced around the grand entryway before stepping inside without invitation. He looked at David, then shifted his gaze to Maria, who had joined them in the foyer, her expression calm but unyielding. "We heard you've been making moves, Mr. Stanton," the man said, his tone dripping with disdain. "But I want to remind you that your time is still ticking. The boss wants to see some serious results soon, or our next visit won't be so polite." David's jaw clenched, and Maria saw the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had been making every effort to rebuild, working long hours, and cutting every unnecessary expense. He'd even sold off several luxury items to make a dent in his debt, but the pressure was relentless. Maria placed a reassuring hand on his arm, urging him to stay calm. "I understand," David replied, his voice steady but strained. "I'm doing everything I can to honor my commitment. I just need a little more time." The man smirked, clearly enjoying David's discomfort. "Time is money, Mr. Stanton, and you're all out of it. You'd better come up with something big, or we'll be back, and we won't be alone." With that, the man turned and left, his footsteps echoing ominously down the hallway. David closed the door, exhaling sharply, and Maria saw the familiar shadow of despair creep over him. She could see how much he wanted to break free, how desperately he was trying to hold himself together, but the constant pressure was beginning to take its toll. That night, after David had gone to bed, Maria stayed up, pacing the halls, her mind racing. She had already gone to great lengths to protect him, but she could feel that they were running out of time. She knew these people wouldn't wait forever, and the thought of them taking everything David had worked for, or worse, haunted her. She needed to find a way to help him, something beyond what they'd already tried. It was then that she remembered an old friend of hers from her teaching days, a retired attorney named Charles who had always been known for his sense of justice and his tenacity in the courtroom. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but she knew that if anyone could offer advice, it would be him. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called, hoping he would remember her. To her relief, Charles answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Maria, it's been ages. How are you?" They caught up briefly, and then Maria explained the situation, describing David's troubles in as much detail as she could without betraying his privacy. Charles listened quietly, his tone growing serious as he took in the gravity of the situation. "Maria, it sounds like these people are taking advantage of David's desperation," he said thoughtfully. "If he signed any contracts under duress, or if they're using predatory practices, there may be a way to challenge their claim. It won't be easy, and it might not solve everything, but it could buy him some breathing room." Maria felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think you could help him, Charles, just to give him a fighting chance?" There was a pause, and then he replied, "I'll see what I can do. Have David bring any paperwork he has, and we'll go through it together." Sometimes, these organizations rely on intimidation to keep people quiet, but if we can find any legal loophole, it might be enough to scare them off. The next day, Maria told David about her conversation with Charles, and though he was initially hesitant, he agreed to meet with the attorney. They gathered every document they could find. The contracts, letters, and records of every transaction David had made with these people. Charles pored over the papers with a meticulous eye, his experience evident in the way he dissected each clause, searching for any possible angle that might give David an advantage. After hours of careful examination, Charles finally looked up, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "There's a clause here," he said, pointing to a line buried deep within the contract. "It's obscure, but it states that if they fail to meet certain disclosure requirements, the contract becomes void. It's a technicality, but it might be enough to get them to back off." David's eyes widened, a spark of hope flickering in his expression. "You mean, I might actually have a way out?" "It's a long shot," Charles warned, "but it's worth a try. These people operate in the shadows, and they rely on fear to keep people compliant. If we can show them that you're willing to fight back, they might decide it's not worth the trouble." Armed with this new strategy, David and Maria prepared to confront the organization once again. This time, they were not alone. They had Charles by their side, ready to challenge the bullies who had threatened to dismantle David's life. The meeting was tense, filled with veiled threats and cold stares, but as Charles laid out the legal implications of their contract violations, Maria saw a shift in the collector's demeanor. By the end of the meeting, The organization's representatives agreed to renegotiate, realizing that pressing further might bring unwanted attention to their practices. David walked out of that room a changed man, the weight of his debts lifted, and the shadow of fear finally beginning to fade. As they returned home, David embraced his mother, his gratitude evident in the way he held her close. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I can ever repay you. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." Maria smiled, tears in her eyes. "All I ever wanted was for you to find happiness, David. You've been given a second chance. Use it wisely." With a newfound sense of purpose, David began to rebuild, focusing on projects that reflected his true values, reconnecting with people who supported his journey, not just his status. He even reached out to others who had been targeted by the same organization, hoping to help them find freedom, just as he had. In the months that followed, David's life transformed. He moved to a smaller, more modest home, choosing simplicity over extravagance. He rekindled relationships he'd neglected and reconnected with the community he once called home. And through it all, Maria stood by his side, watching with pride as her son finally reclaimed the person he was always meant to be. David had learned the hard way, but his journey had changed him for the better. He had not only found his way back to himself, but had also built a life that reflected his true character, one of integrity, humility, and kindness. And as he looked, months passed, and as winter turned to spring, David's life had taken on a new, quiet rhythm that brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The once imposing mansion was now only a memory, replaced by a modest, charming house on the edge of town, a home where he could finally be himself without the weight of pretense. He had let go of the expensive trappings that had once defined him. The luxury cars, the high-end suits, the grand house. Instead, his life was now filled with meaningful work and people who truly cared for him. Maria continued to stay with him, her gentle presence a constant reminder of the values he'd returned to. She watched with pride as David rebuilt his business with integrity, focusing on projects that aligned with his new outlook on life. No longer driven by a need to prove himself or keep up appearances, he had found a way to channel his skills into helping others, including several charitable initiatives that supported struggling families and young entrepreneurs. One day, while Maria was working in the garden, she was approached by a young woman from the neighborhood who had heard about David's past troubles and recent transformation. She was a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and she shyly asked Maria if David would be willing to meet with her to discuss some business ideas she had. Maria saw the hesitation and vulnerability in the woman's eyes, reminding her of the countless times she herself had faced hardship with a child to raise. "I'm sure he'd love to meet you," Maria said warmly, sensing an opportunity for David to give back in a way that mattered. She invited the woman inside, where David greeted her with a welcoming smile. They spent hours discussing her ideas, David listening intently and offering guidance with a kindness and patience that came from his own experience with struggle and failure. As the young mother left, her face radiant with hope, Maria felt a surge of pride for the man her son had become. As weeks went by, more people from the community reached out, each with their own dreams and aspirations, looking for support and mentorship. David welcomed them all, transforming his small home into a place of learning, a space where people from all walks of life could gather, share their stories, and find encouragement. He organized workshops, teaching skills in business and financial literacy, drawing from both his successes and his failures to offer a well-rounded perspective. Maria helped him organize these gatherings, often providing homemade treats and coffee for the attendees, her warmth adding a welcoming touch to every meeting. One evening, after the last guest had left, David and Maria sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above the quiet town. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the soft sounds of crickets created a serene backdrop to their conversation. "Mom," David said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I owe you everything. Without you, I don't know where I'd be today. I was so lost, so consumed by things that didn't matter. You gave me a second chance to truly live, to be happy." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with both pride and a touch of sadness. "David, you found your way back because you chose to. I only helped you see what was already there inside you. Life will always present us with choices, and you chose the hard path, the one that led you back to your true self." He nodded, taking her words to heart, grateful that she had seen him through his darkest days. But there was one question that lingered, one he hadn't dared to ask until now. "Do you think Dad would be proud of me?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with a vulnerability that only Maria could truly understand. A soft smile spread across her face as she reached out to take his hand. "Your father was always proud of you, David. And he would be even prouder now, seeing the man you've become. He believed in living with honesty and kindness, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're honoring his memory in the best way possible." They sat in silence for a while, both comforted by the thought. The journey had been long and difficult, but David felt a deep sense of peace knowing he was on the right path, one that aligned with the values his parents had instilled in him. As David's new business gained traction, he began to see the impact of his work spread throughout the town. The young entrepreneurs he had mentored started their own small ventures, and the sense of community flourished as people supported one another, sharing resources and knowledge. The town, once quiet and struggling, now had a renewed sense of purpose, with new businesses and initiatives bringing life and opportunity back to the area. David found himself at the center of it all, not as a wealthy mogul, but as a trusted mentor, a guide who helped others find their own path to success without sacrificing their integrity. One day, he received a letter from Charles, the attorney who had helped them negotiate with the collectors. In it, Charles praised David's transformation and invited him to speak at a local event on resilience and ethical business practices. At first, David hesitated, unsure if he was ready to stand in front of a crowd and share his story. But Maria encouraged him, reminding him of the power of his journey and how much his experiences could inspire others. When the day of the event arrived, David stood before a packed room, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. He spoke openly about his struggles, the mistakes he had made, and the moments of despair that had nearly broken him. But he also spoke of the redemption he had found through honesty, humility, and the support of his mother. His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom were facing their own challenges. Afterward, people approached him, sharing how his story had given them hope and courage to face their own struggles. As David returned home that night, he felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace with himself, no longer haunted by the shadows of his past. He had reclaimed his life, his purpose, and his identity. And he had done so not by chasing wealth or status, but by staying true to the values his parents had taught him. Back at home, Maria was waiting for him on the porch, a gentle smile on her face as she saw the pride and happiness shining in his eyes. They sat together in the cool evening air, not needing to say anything, simply enjoying the quiet joy of a life rebuilt on a foundation of love, trust, and resilience. As the months turned into years, David continued to make a difference in his community, his life an example of the power of second chances and the strength that can be found in facing one's mistakes with courage. Maria remained by his side, her presence a steady source of wisdom and warmth, watching with pride as her son flourished in ways she had always known he could. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Maria turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "David," she said softly, "if you could go back and change anything, would you?" He thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't think I would, Mom," he replied, his voice steady. "Every mistake, every setback, it all led me here, to this life, to this person I am now. I had to go through it to understand what really matters." Maria smiled, her heart full, knowing that he had finally found peace. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the world, David felt a quiet certainty settle within him, a certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Their journey had been long, marked by challenges, sacrifices, and hard-won wisdom, but in the end, they had found their way, not to a life of wealth and power, but to a life of purpose, grounded in the simple, unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. As they watched the last rays of sunlight fade, Maria looked at David and posed a question, one that would stay with him long after she was gone. Do you think, David, that we find our strength in our failures as much as in our successes? David looked at her, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. I think we do, Mom, he said quietly. Maybe even more so, because it's only when we're broken that we truly learn how to rebuild. And with that, they sat in the comforting silence of the dusk, knowing that they had not only rebuilt a life, but had rediscovered what truly mattered along the way.